Today I'd like to show you my collection of vintage and antique items, mostly focused around fashion and sewing. The majority of the items in this video are relatively inexpensive paper ephemera that I used while researching vintage and historical fashion, but I've also got quite a few Victorian things and some vintage clothing. I've timestamped every single item in this video if you'd like to jump around, so let's get into it. So first I have this box here, which holds most of my vintage fashion catalogs. And the first two catalogs inside are Vogue pattern books. These were basically just used to advertise what sewing patterns that Vogue had to offer for the season. So here we've got October, November 1947, and here June, July 1947. I have to say, this 1947 to 1952 period is one of my favorite eras of fashion. I just think that the silhouette is just so flattering. The use of pockets to make the hips look wider, influenced by the Dior new look, I just think it's so pretty. Vogue was definitely a more expensive pattern company, and so aside from just sewing patterns, they also have lots of other things. Like just for example, they have the sewing patterns you can buy, but they also have this informational page about buttons. And these books are just great because, you know, the art is really beautiful inside, and you can just really get a feel for what people who were interested in fashion in the 1940s really would have worn and tried to emulate. Okay, I have to stop looking at this. I don't have time. So here's October, November 1947. In this book, we're definitely going to see more winter wear. And what I really love about this book in particular is that it has an entire section on the Dior new look, basically. And it talks about the changing silhouette and how padding would be used to pad out the hips. Next, we have this catalog, which is by Berth Robert. This one I'm pretty sure is from the early 40s. But Berth Robert was mainly a 1930s company, and they kind of went under very shortly after this one came out. I already made a video flipping through this catalog. It's kind of old, but if you want to check that out. I also have a scan of this listed on my Etsy store. I find it really interesting to see what teenagers wore throughout history, and so I really love this catalog because it shows a lot of their more casual styles. It's kind of interesting because I feel like you see skirts like this and like this all the time in any videos of teenagers from the 1940s, but skirts like this and just like basics don't really survive. Like, I don't see them basically at all in vintage shops or being resold online, so I kind of wonder what happened to them. It's probably a case of, because they were so versatile, they were just used until they were worn out in the decades that followed the 1940s. And the whole gimmick for this company was that they would send you the pattern pieces of a garment and then you would sew it together so that it would end up being a bit cheaper and you could really get a great fit on it. Next is this book, which is a sewing guide from 1943. They basically just tell you basically everything you need to know for vintage sewing, and I found this in a used bookstore, so I was so excited when I picked it out. Because it's not just sewing, it's also knowledge about clothes. Like, they advise you on what fabrics will wear well, what fabrics would be worn for what occasion, and how to wash them, and it's just a great resource for learning about vintage fashion. The everyday aspect of the consumption of clothes in the past just really interests me. One of my favorite topics. Next is one of my oldest items, probably. This is a catalog from 1904. It's a Stearns catalog, cover unfortunately detached. But I also have a video flipping through this catalog as well. Yeah, it's just a whole bunch of Edwardian fashion inside. This is really cool too, this illustration of the actual building. Whenever anyone ever asks me, if you were to go back in time, what time would you choose? I always choose either the Victorian era or the 1940s for one reason, because I want to go to a department store and just look around, you know? So this is a book of 1940s knitting patterns, again marketed towards teenagers, one of my favorite topics. And I do have a few of these patterns up for sale on my Etsy. This is hideous though, I don't know why anyone would ever want this. I'm definitely going to make this one at some point though, I think it's really pretty. My favorite part though is definitely the back cover. It's just so beautiful to see the diversity of colors available, because I feel like everyone always imagines the past as the period dramas depict it, browns and grays and like dark blues, but you saw in the Vogue catalogs, colors were actually really bright, and I feel like we just forget that these days. This, I think, is my newest acquired catalog. My friend saw this in an antique store and bought it for me, so thank you very much. And a catalog like this would have been a supplementary to something like this, which I'll show you in a second. This is just extra designs that they couldn't fit in the large Sears catalog. September 25th, 1945. And yeah, just another resource for looking at 1940s fashion and seeing the sort of materials that things were made of. And lastly, but definitely not least, is my Montgomery Ward's 1947 Spring and Summer catalog. There are catalog flip-throughs available on YouTube already for this. But this has been one of the most valuable resources to me in just understanding a bit more about fabric and 1940s fashion and what things would have been made of. I kind of want those. Again, yeah, just look at how bright the colors are. Like, look at that bright green suit. And catalogs like this had literally everything. Like, even on just this random page, house paint, a kitchen, like... And the last thing in this box is a pennant from the 1940 New York World's Fair. These fade pretty easily, and so I keep it at the bottom of this box, but I really wish I could display it because it's so pretty. There's actually an interesting story behind this one. So the father of one of my family friends was actually a collector of items from the 1939 World's Fair. That's like the coolest thing in my opinion. But as he got older, he eventually sold his collection to a local antique store, and I had no idea that my family friend's father did this, and so coincidentally I went to the same antique store and thought it was really cool and bought one, and turns out I have like a personal relation to the guy who collected these. If you've seen my latest YouTube short, I actually used clips from a promotional video from the 1939 World's Fair. So yeah, this is definitely one of my favorite pieces that I own. So these are my 4 vintage children's sewing machines. I actually made an entire video about the history of these. It's like a 9-minute video essay. So just very briefly, Singer started making these children's sewing machines in 1911, and they marketed them to children and young women who were perhaps in college and didn't have the space for a full sewing machine. So this one I believe is from the 20s, 30s, or 40s, and it's the most complete one I have, and it's in fully working condition. This one does not work and it's missing a lot of pieces, and I'd like to restore it one day, but I haven't gotten around to it. This machine is from the 1950s, and I actually have the original box and a whole bunch of the other components, which I'll show you in a second. And this machine is a knockoff of the Singer Model 20 or Sewhandy, which is what all of these are, and it's just not up to the same level of quality as the others. So here's the box with all of the accessories for my Singer machines. But first, this is a pair of 1960s gloves that my grandma gave me. They've never been worn. They're still sewn together. So I guess first I'll go through the stuff that came with the knockoff sewing machine, not the Singer. So first is the original label. I'll try and put a picture on the screen of what it used to look like, and also an instructions manual for it. And this is the original box. So I bought this machine off eBay from an older gentleman who was selling his wife's sewing machine for her. So that's why it says Janet's sewing machine from childhood here. And it was originally $7.50. Moving on to the 1950s Singer Sewhandy. This was the original box for that. As you can see, all sides. And I tried to wrap up all the pieces inside. I wasn't sure if like the oxidation of the paper and the metal or something would do something to them if they were all touching each other. I don't know. So this was to unscrew the needle, I believe. This is the original needle threader. And this is the original needle case, now empty. I also have the original instructions manual, and this is actually really thorough for a children's toy. Like, it doesn't just tell you basically everything you need to know about the machine itself, but it also gives you some sewing instructions as well. It tells you what needles you should use for what types of fabric. And lastly in this box, I've got another catalog, which is from 1960, and I believe when I bought this, it said that a catalog like this with this nice cover would have been distributed within the company or given to like executives or something like that. Honestly, I don't really know why I bought this because I don't really have like a great affinity with early 60s fashion, late 50s sort of stuff. I did get a pretty good deal on it though, so maybe like as an investment, I guess. This kind of looks like the dress that Audrey Hepburn wears in Breakfast at Tiffany's, but this came out before that movie. So yeah, not very much has changed in the past like 10-20 years since the other big catalog that we've looked at. Swimsuits look very similar, I have to say. That's pretty cool, this luggage here. Stuff's really expensive these days. Oh, that's interesting. I think these are all like natural colors, but there was like a fad in like the late 50s where a lot of women were dyeing their hair like really crazy colors. So here I've got some sewing notions for this stuff. First, these 3 spools. I believe these spools are what goes on looms, like for weaving fabric. I don't know if you've ever seen like the pictures of the children working in the textile mills from the turn of the century. That's like one of the really famous pictures of child labor. This is the sort of thing that would have gone on one of those looms. When I first got these, I tried to do a bit of research on them. Some of these small items, like I'll show you in a second my pharmacy bottles, like you're actually able to find out where they came from, but these I unfortunately wasn't able to find any information on. As you can see, this one says wads on it. This one says something I can't quite make out. R Club something. So yeah, that's that. Most of these are just decorative. They don't really have very much history behind them. These 3 things came with my child sewing machine that's broken. Lastly, the most interesting bit of my sewing notions. So it comes in a case like this, and in the Victorian era, little sewing notions like this were a very common gift and not really meant to be used. It comes in a velvet lined case, either Victorian or Edwardian. So it says M McL to J McL. And yeah, this is a really cool piece. So this is a Victorian iron, and obviously this is from before electricity, and so how this works is it opens up just like this. Right, I forgot about this piece inside. And you put water inside and you keep it on your stove so that it stays hot, and then you're able to iron your clothing with it. I don't know if you can see that, but inside it says Vitlac, Italy, Vitlach. I'm not sure what that is. On the bottom, someone carved 1979. And it also comes with this stand so that when you're not using the iron, you can just stand it on here. So this is a 1950s vanity tray right here. It's a bit dusty, I have to clean it. And on top of this vanity tray, I keep this container with bobby pins. This is 30s or 40s depression glass. All of these little items sit on doilies that I've crocheted from vintage patterns, but you can find things like this really cheaply in antique stores and thrift stores. This is a vintage buckle of some sort. Until I find a project that I can use it on, it just sits on my vanity. And these are antique pharmacy bottles. And on these bottles is information about the pharmacy where they came from. And what's really great about this is that in like trades books and stuff that basically said all of the happenings in a trade in a specific city, they're actually preserved online. So if you just look this up in Google Books, you're able to find a lot of very interesting information about where these bottles came from. So first is this one. It says Otto Alpers at the top. So in July of 1912, Otto Alpers bought this pharmacy from Felix Hirschman, and then he sold it in September 1915 to Otto P. Gilbert. Also of note, it was a Jergens lotion bottle before he turned it into a medicine bottle. That's probably where the original label was, and he just put another label on the back. So this bottle comes from Frank J. McGarry, and this pharmacist got in a little bit of a scandal in 1909 because his partner in the pharmacy business was a former middleweight boxer. However, in 1908, a law was passed that prevented anyone who wasn't like a registered pharmacist from being in the business, so the boxer kind of got kicked out. He was in the pharmacy news a few more times for uninteresting reasons, but in 1916 there was actually a fire in his store and it did $5,000 in damages. And on the bottom of the bottle, I don't know if you can see that, but it says Wyeth. And Wyeth was another pharmacist from Philadelphia who was very successful, so this is probably just a reused bottle. And lastly is this little 1950s travel clock. It unfortunately does not run, but as you can see, it folds up like that. There's an alarm in it as well, and it's pretty common to see these in antique stores. I've also got this lipstick ad from June 1930. I actually got this for free because my mom wanted to buy a vintage ad to hang in her bathroom, and this just came for free with it, and I framed it. So next is probably my most interesting box. There's a lot of really good stuff in here. So first I have my Victorian Stereoscope cards. They were put in a special machine where you're able to somehow see these pictures together in 3D. So this one is from 1889 and it's called Waiting for Pure Fresh Milk, and it was taken in Littleton, New Hampshire, and it was sold by Underwood and Underwood. This next one is of Yosemite in California. It's crazy to think that it still looks the same today, even though this was taken with such an old camera and such a long time ago. This one is from the 1860s, maybe the late 1850s. I'm not exactly sure about that time period in particular. And it says, "As the twig is bent, so the tree inclines." This one is also a dinner scene, but from much later. I would guess to be like right around the turn of the century. On the back, in handwriting, it actually says who's on there. It says Mrs. Charles Gatton, son Ernest Gatton, husband Charles Gatton in their home. So I kind of wonder, like, was this card in particular mass distributed like the others, or was this made for this family in particular? Next, I have my Workbasket magazines. So this was a needlework magazine that ran from, I think, the 1930s to, I think they were sold sometime in the 60s. And if I show you one of my earlier issues, here's May 1947, 8 to 16 pages. and they were pretty much exclusively patterns. But over the course of my collection, this is my last one in 1955, at most they could be like 80 pages or so, but as you can see, they expanded into sewing patterns, lots and lots of advertising in these, as well as just craft patterns in general. I do have a few of these patterns available for sale on my Etsy. Yeah, recipes and bits of information that their viewers would send in. So yeah, I have to count them again, but I think I have between 40 and 50, and I got them for just a few dollars because most of them I bought on eBay. It was technically an auction, but since nobody really wants these, I was the only one who bid, and I bid like $1, and I got so many of them. Next, I've got my vintage sewing pattern collection. This is my first vintage sewing pattern. I've used it twice before on the channel. It's just for a basic 1940s blouse. I'm not sure if I've used this one before. I know I've made it, but I'm not sure if I made a video about it. But I have used pieces from this pattern before in other projects. This is a pretty cool pattern. It's for this 10 gore skirt, and you don't really see like a skirt with that many gores in the 1940s. And I definitely made this before, and I don't think I made a video about it. I don't know if you can hear that. It's really pouring outside. This is another really common sewing pattern of just a 1940s suit. It looks kind of like between 1944 and 46 to me. This pattern I got for literally just a few dollars, and it's in that 1947 to 52 range that I was talking about how I really love. This sewing pattern came from the one lot that I purchased of probably around like 10 or 15 patterns. I'd like to make it again at some point now that my sewing skills are a bit better. So this was also one of my first sewing patterns, and it's for a 1950s dress, probably from 52, 53. It's a mail order sewing pattern, and there's no brand associated with it. And actually when I got it, it was factory folded, and I unfolded it to make the dress, which I kind of regret. It kind of goes against how I feel now about like preserving these patterns. This is a sewing pattern that I bought off eBay, I believe. It's just a really common early 50s design. I believe this one's from 1949. This video is actually one of my best performing sewing videos. This is my only Vogue pattern, and I made a YouTube short about this one. Also, the pattern is not nearly as like wide and conical as it is in the picture. Kind of false advertising. This is another pattern from that same lot. It's for a 1950s swimsuit. The size is a bit large on me, so I don't know if I'll ever use this, but I do really like the design of the top here and the shorts, and I might make them as separates. This is a cool pattern. It's for a 1950s raincoat. I don't really like it as a raincoat, so I'd have to do a bit of thinking about what other fabrics I would make it out of. Here's some basic 1950s skirt patterns. If I were to guess, that'd probably be between 54 and 56. Here's another basic 1950s dress. And it's missing pretty much everything, just from my notes here. 55 or 56, I'm feeling. And a few more items in this box. This is the other advertisement from the lipstick ad that I showed you before. It came with 2 free ads. So this is a postcard for American Airlines from the 1940s, and it's unused. Here are some more postcards that I bought from the same antique store. I don't know, I just thought they were pretty cool. This is a 1940s Cameo Pendant. It's one of my favorite necklaces that I have, and I also made a YouTube short about it. So this is a fashion plate from 1879, and I found it in an antique store. There was a bin of like so many fashion plates. This was actually one of the later ones. There were like Regency ones, there were ones from the 1850s. I probably should have bought more, but this is the only one I got, and I got it framed because I love it so much. So next I've got some music stuff that probably won't interest everyone, but this is a radio from the 1930s or 40s. I don't think it works, or maybe I've just only tried it in places where there's no signal. I'm a bit scared to try it though, because like here we've got like an 80-year-old cord, and it would be a lie to say that I'd look forward to plugging this into my wall. And lastly, I have a Simon & Garfunkel poster. So it doesn't really fit in frame, but this is an ad for Simon & Garfunkel in, I think, Rolling Stone? Oh no, sorry, Billboard. Lastly, we have my vintage clothing collection. So you guys have probably seen this dress before. I made a video where I recreated it. So this dress is from the late 30s or early 40s, I'm not exactly sure. And all of its measurements match mine, but because I have wide shoulders, I'm unable to wear it. And so to remedy that, I decided to recreate it as faithfully as I could to the original. It is handmade. Some of the sewing inside is a little bit questionable, but I really like all the details on it. It's one of my favorite pieces. Next is my newest addition to my collection. This is a 1970s denim dress that I got in a vintage shop a few weeks ago. But yeah, I really love it. I think it's really flattering, and I'm glad I have a piece from a decade that I usually don't gravitate towards. Next is this 1940s box pleated skirt. You know how I was talking about earlier how these very basic pieces from the 1940s usually don't survive? Well, this one did, and so when I saw it, I knew I had to have it. So this is pretty typical of what a teenager in the 1940s would have worn on a day-to-day basis. If you look on the label here, it literally says college teen, and it's got a metal zipper as well. This is one of the vintage pieces that I probably wear the most. This is a basic 1950s sweater. When I bought this, I kind of expected a sweater like some of these, but I think this one was originally a size much larger than me, but it like shrunk in the wash or something to fit me in some places but not in others. So when I do wear it, I wear something else over it to kind of cover up the areas that don't fit. And lastly is the piece that I definitely wear the most. So this is a Letterman jacket from probably the 1980s, but it's not like one of those cheap quality ones. It's like actual wool and a few leather accents. The collar is also quite large and it's kind of reminiscent of the 1940s, which I really like. My favorite part of this jacket is this big Vikings patch on the back. I think it's really cool. That's my complete antiques collection. If you'd like to see the things that I create using these resources, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.